All right, hello everybody. It is time for the first part of Chapter 11 of Rothbard's America's Great Depression. This chapter is titled "The Hoover New Deal of 1932," and we're going to cover the first half of it, basically, up through page 301 in the edition that I have, through the section titled "Government Relief." After that, there's a big section on inflation, which was another thing that they did in 1932. Apparently, I haven't gotten through it yet, but there's a big chunk of the rest of the second half of the chapter that is dedicated to looking at the central bank, spurred on by the Treasury's attempts to further inflate the currency to fight against the Depression in 1932. But setting that aside for next week, we will start with the start of the chapter. So, Rothbard notes that at the start of 1932, Hoover was ready to do more stuff. And, of course, he was blindly oblivious to the fact that the stuff that he had done had made things worse. And so, therefore, his intentions to do good were more important than actually doing good. He made an annual message to Congress on December 8th of 1931, where he's basically is pumping up his own record, basically, oblivious of their negative effects, and claiming that we need more government intervention to fix the Depression, despite the fact that he had done unprecedented levels of tinkering in order to try to fix it beforehand, and all of that had just made it worse. Rothbard starts the chapter with a big list of Hoover's, basically a big wish list by Hoover that he presented to Congress. And we're just going to go through these one at a time real quick. Rothbard doesn't cover them in too much detail here. They're going to be, covered later in the chapter, but right now we want the wish list. So, number 1, a Reconstruction Finance Corporation which would lend to banks, industry, agricultural credit agencies, and local governments in order to do more government stuff. Basically, more of the same of what's already been done. Number 2, broaden eligibility for discounting at the Fed. Effectively lower interest rates. More easy money, more credit to unqualified borrowers. Number 3, to create a home loan bank system to revive construction and employment measures. So basically, get more people working on government boondoggles, and make a bunch of more money available for that particular purpose. All right, you'll see a little jump cut there because I realized there was something in my notes that I didn't mention. But number 4, in the list that Rothbard makes of the things that Hoover wanted from Congress, was more aid to federal land banks. And Rothbard doesn't say what these are, so I went and looked it up. I found a business history review or something article that at least gave me a definition. Basically, what the federal land banks were banks that were, funded by the government that subsidized mortgages on farmland specifically. These were, and the way that these subsidized mortgages work were not exactly just like, hey, here's a mortgage. What they ended up creating were private companies, and I'm quoting that paper now, that relied on the implicit backing of the federal government for support. And so we see more propping up of otherwise unprofitable businesses by the federal government in this number 4 desire from Hoover. Number 5, the Public Works Administration. Hoover wanted the Public Works Administration to coordinate more public works. Again, continuing with the same notion of consuming labor and capital in things that are not particularly wanted by anybody except the government. Number 6, Hoover wanted Congress to legalize his immigration restrictions, and I note here this is a really, really strong evidence that the Hoover administration was acting lawlessly in a very significant way at the time. Nowadays, we don't think anything of the executive branch making up laws on its own. But here, Hoover was like, you guys gotta, I know I did this thing by my, velvet-covered iron fist, but, I need you guys to actually make this into law. It's worth noting that as we go down the list, Rothbard seems to get gradually angrier and angrier at the things that Hoover is suggesting. Number 7, Weaken competition in natural resource use, which Rothbard notes mean to... Well, so he said weaken destructive competition, and Rothbard says, i.e. competition in natural resource use. So Rothbard's starting to get a little tired of these, but we're going to keep going. Number 8. Grant 3 direct loans, $300 million to states. And loans is, I suspect in quotes in a pretty significant way. And number 9, to reform bankruptcy laws and weaken protections for creditors. It's worth noting that this is kind of that toxic charity mindset that assumes that anyone who lends money is necessarily, rolling in dough, and anyone who borrows money is necessarily the victim when they're unable to pay back what they borrowed. It's funny because, even a person with not that much in funds can contribute to an organization that lends money to businesses. You can buy, even if you're a relatively small investor, you can buy corporate bonds. And when the government says that your corporate bonds are a different priority on bankruptcy than you thought they were when you bought them, that's fraud, basically. That's the government taking your agreement with that company as to what priority you have in the event of bankruptcy proceedings, and switching it around to benefit people other than you. It's basically a taking, and this is something that happened a lot in the Great Recession as well. This was done, I think, for the auto industries. That some of the bondholders were left holding the bag, basically. There's 2 other things that don't go into the numbered list that Rothbard has, but he also mentions that Hoover wanted Congress to protect the railroads and to institute more share-the-work programs. And we already know that these share-the-work programs do 2 things. Number 1, they keep unproductive people working in places where they're not being productive, and they keep unemployment artificially, apparently low, because people are getting some work. So... not a great list from Hoover here, and Rothbard gets pretty angry at it by the end as well. With that said, we're going to go on to the next section of the chapter called The Tax Increase. So, bottom line, giant deficits. Hoover's idea, raise taxes. The Revenue Act of 1932 drastically raised taxes in a variety of places. It revived wartime excise taxes, which Rothbard doesn't mention this, but to me this is like, ooh. So, in the Soviet Union, they had this thing called war communism, right? Where everything had to be really, really carefully centrally controlled for the purposes of the war effort. And once the war was over, they continued with war communism because they thought it would give them better productivity, when in fact it actually wasted a bunch of resources and caused a bunch of people to, become more impoverished and starve. This kind of, to me, has hints of that in the background, that we're instituting wartime, austerity measures against the people during peacetime because we don't know what else to do. Not a great look for Hoover or that Congress. They increased sales taxes. They created some new taxes on various types of stock sales. They instituted or increased utility taxes on things like telephones, telegraphs, radio messages. They increased the personal income tax and the corporate income tax, and they got rid of an exemption for small businesses. Another big thing that they did was they increased the estate tax. Hoover, of course, with all of his anti-economic thoughts, was like, well, the estate tax is really bad because it makes all these millionaire playboys that just walk around and waste all their funds on frivolous things. And and so he gets this moral idea that the estate tax is like this some great thing, but actually an estate tax is extremely destructive to capital accumulation because it discourages people from producing things that last beyond their lives. Rothbard also notes, for instance, that in order for those millionaire playboys to maintain their fortunes, they either have to spend very little, or they have to somehow manage those fortunes in such a way that they don't fritter them away. And so it's a self-correcting problem in the actual market, and not something that you need government to point guns at people's heads to deal with. Postage rates were increased even though the post offices or the United States Postal Service was currently in a surplus. These got pushback from some economists, but not enough. Basically, it was all ignored. Let's see. There was one of the most, to quote Rothbard, one of the most cogent critiques of Hoover's astoundingly wrong-headed program was delivered by the St. Louis Chamber of Commerce. Skipping a bit, the taxpayers, it insisted, should obtain a reduction of both taxes and government expenditures. And the Atlanta Constitution called the 1932 Tax Act the most vicious tax bill ever saddled on the country in time of peace. So, yeah, basically government is overspending, and their solution is to raise taxes because, well, we got to get rid of this deficit. And raising taxes is not the way to do that because it usually just encourages the government to spend more. Because after all, if a 5% deficit was acceptable last year, then a 5% deficit will be acceptable this year. And next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that, ad infinitum. So, the next section in the chapter is titled Expenditures versus Economy, and Rothbard notes at the start of this section that despite the tax increases, tax revenue actually fell because the economy was in such free fall, and the deficit, of course, continued to expand, or at least remain significant. The expenditures fell a little bit, but not enough to make up for the fact that the economy was dropping so fast that tax revenues were falling at a ridiculous pace. Expenditures on veterans loans and grants to state and local governments declined. As a result, state and local governments were forced to abandon some of their plans for public works because they couldn't afford them without federal funding. Rothbard notes that the percentage of government depredation on the private product rose. That is to say that the government was chomping at a bigger chunk, percentage-wise, of a smaller economy, which made things even worse for everybody. Except government people. There was an attempt to put out a massive veteran bonus. That failed in Congress. There was a National Economy Committee that later changed its name to the National Economy League, which actually demanded vague but reduced spending, kind of good-ish. However, it fell prey to the public work fallacy that basically was like, well, we can't get rid of any public works because those are getting people employed, and so therefore those should be untouchable federal spending. There was a lot of pressure to reduce government expenditures from a few angles, but they were all rejected by Hoover. In page 291, Hoover, I'll just quote this because it's great. Protesting businessmen who urged him to reduce expenses by $2 billion, Hoover answered with the typical hysteria of the bureaucrat. Your thesis, and now Rothbard is quoting Hoover, your thesis is that the government expenses can be reduced by $2 billion, the amount of the tax decrease. This is wholly impossible. It would mean we must give up the Postal Service, the Merchant Marine, protection of life and property, and public health. We would have to turn 40,000 prisoners loose in this country. We would have to stop the maintenance of rivers and harbors. We would have to stop all construction work going on in aid of unemployment. It would mean abolishment, of the Army and Navy. In other words, it means complete chaos. This is, of course, highly reminiscent of one of Thomas Sowell's great parables, the parable of the Department for Life-Saving Medicine for Children and Statues of Benedict Arnold. This is a humorous a humorous parable that he created in one of his books. I forget which one exactly. But basically the idea is that let's assume that there's a government agency that is tasked with two things. Number one, the provision of life-saving medicine to children, and number two, the building of statues of Benedict Arnold throughout the country. If that department, under normal circumstances, that department's budget continually rises gradually. But if at any point there comes a point where someone says, oh, we need to cut the budget of this department, the first thing that department will claim to be lost when their budget was cut will be the life-saving medicine being given to children and not the statues for Benedict Arnold, when in fact they could probably take the whole budget cut out of the statue making. It's one of those things that bureaucracy has the incentive to do, especially government bureaucracy. They're basically protecting their own paychecks by and this works in two ways. Whenever their budget increases, there's an incentive to put their budget to the worst things that they do, to minimize the positive effects of that budget increase so they can ask for more. And then after that, whenever there's a suggestion that their budget might be decreased, they propose to decrease the best things that they do instead of the worst things that they do, so that people will feel the pain more. This is kind of evident in like when the government shut down and they cut off people's access to public parks, things like that. So despite the pressure to reduce government expenditures that Hoover rejected, well, the reason he rejected them was because there were a bunch of radicals who were urging more and more spending, and so it's kind of the fallacy of the middle or something like that. I forget what the number is, but false dilemma maybe, or fallacy of the middle, where like, well, these people are saying increase expenditures and these people are saying decrease expenditures, so the correct answer must be somewhere in the middle. And yeah, things just got worse because, the people screaming for more free money were, of course, louder than the people making logical arguments about decreasing expenditures. Next section, public works agitation. And my personal note here is, the addiction is real. These public works did not exist in 1929. It's important to note that. This is 1932. It's only 3 years after the stock market crash. And now everybody is saying these public works are absolutely vital for their, to quote Mel Brooks' script, I think he wrote the script for Blazing Saddles, their phony baloney jobs. Most economists, of course, because they're on the payroll, approve of more public works. A few give good rebuttals, but even some of those rebuttals had really awful alternatives. Like there was one guy, Wilford I. King of New York University, this is page 293, suggested massive inflation instead of reducing, in addition to reducing public works. One of the best comments, quoting Rothbard, was from a guy named William A. Barrage of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. And he basically said that public works, what they do, net, is they occupy labor and capital that otherwise would be used by the market to fix the depression. Basically, you take things that are unused and you make them unavailable for a long period of time, right? These public works, these people were given jobs, but not just jobs for today. They were given jobs for, you'll work for us for 6 months. Well, what that does is if during that whole 6-month interim, there's some intelligent businessman who says, oh, I have a great idea, some entrepreneur. He says, oh, I have a great idea. I need labor to do this. All of those laborers that are stuck in this 6-month make work, dragging rocks back and forth job can't be used for that, or at least they can't be used for that without him having to outbid the government. The government has infinite money. So it really hurts the Depression to take these idle resources and force them into extended use, because number one, you use up capital on things that nobody wants. Number two, you lock in labor and give it a never-ending spigot of money that now businessmen have to compete with in order to get them to do something actually productive to help the economy. Basically, you end up with all these negative effects. And what ends up happening, of course, because the government, isn't paying for that is to say, the government officials aren't feeling the burn of all this extra spending. There was another bidding war, page 294, for public works. I'm just going to read this because it's another, because we saw this in the previous chapter where like someone's like, I think we should have $2 billion of make work, and then some guy's like 5, 7, 10. J. Cheever Cowden, a New York investment banker, proposed an annual $4 to $5 billion public works program forever. Malcolm C. Rorty wanted $1 billion spent per year. Owen Young, Alfred Smith, and Franklin Roosevelt. That must be an error. William Wren. I think there's an error in the edit here. I'll have to look up the old version and see what's going on here. Let me mark that, actually. I don't usually mark in books. I usually do this. But like when I see something that looks like a mistake, I will mark in a book. William Randolph Hearst suggested $5.5 billion property bond issue for federal public works. This was endorsed in January 1932 by 31 economists. Yeah, so in the summer of 1932, there were three or four books released about public works, supporting public works, giving government justifications for public works. They were Stuart Chase's The New Deal, David Cushman Coyle's The Irrepressible Conflict, and George Soul's A Planned Society. I'll have links for all these in the description if you want to take a look at them. But what ended up happening was that Hoover finally was like, these public works don't seem to be working. We've thrown a bunch of money and a bunch of labor and a bunch of capital in these things. They don't seem to be having a positive effect. Well, technically, he only said that non-self-liquidating public works were not working. So it's kind of a, damning with faint praise. He still was in favor of more dams, more toll bridges, and more slum clearance, which are apparently self-liquidating. Now, we talked about self-liquidating stuff in when we were talking about self-liquidating acceptances back several chapters ago. And so I assume that self-liquidating means in this case that it's public works for a specific purpose that finishes and then is done. Like there's no maintenance required, which doesn't seem to be strictly true for dams, toll bridges, you can maybe say that slum clearance works that way, but if you don't maintain slum clearance, it doesn't stay cleared unless you figure out a way to de-slumify it. But anyway, with all that said, Hoover starts to decry public works, but way too little, way too late, and way too conditional that to stop anything from happening. So moving forward, we enter the next section of this chapter called the RFC, or the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This was passed in January. It was given $500 million and an authorization to spend up to $1.5 billion to basically prop up failing businesses. Hoover selected a socialist chairman for it, which, you give a nationalizer the ability to pick winners and losers, and you're going to have problems. But it's even worse than that, because at first they kept the receivers of these, loans secret on the justification that the public, if they knew that a company or an organization was getting these RFC loans, that they would dislike that company and there might be negative market consequences, which of course there should be. So for 5 months they kept everything all hush hush until finally they were forced to disclose operations. And start telling the people that they freaking work for, hypothetically, what they were doing. And in fact, when you give a body like the RFC a socialist chairman and a certain amount of money to play with, they play with the money. So what they basically did is, you'll love this. Oh God. Most of their loans went to banks and railroads, and it's even worse than that, because it didn't just go to railroads, it went to railroads that were indebted to banks. And so it almost all went to banks. It was basically just a gigantic subsidy to failing banks that had taken on bad loans in order to keep those banks afloat so that they could continue to make bad loans. In addition, it's even worse than that. In addition, the whole thing was run as a grift for Republicans at the time as well. General Charles Dawes is an example of this. He basically resigned as president of the RFC on June 7th, and then less than 3 weeks later, the Chicago bank that he headed, the Central Republic Bank and Trust Company, got a loan from the RFC of $90 million, even though the bank's total deposits were only $95 million. That's like an FDIC crisis loan level, crisis payment level of loan. And so they also had to be like, you can't be part of the RFC and also like run a bank. They had to put that like minor paper thin defense in there later, but it wasn't there to begin with. The successor to Dawes as head of the RFC was the Honorable Atlee Pomerine, whose great contribution to economic wisdom was his pronouncement that he would like to compel all merchants to increase their purchases by 33%. Basically, they handed the reins over to an economically illiterate tyrant, which, always is going to make something like the RFC work better. There were massive subsidies to railroads, primarily to pay off debts. This was a massive wealth transfer from the people to the banks. Basically, taxpayers were paying banks to get away from bad loans. Sounds familiar. The worst thing is that some of these railroad companies seem to falsify their records, pay off their debts, and then go bankrupt, leaving all of that property also to the bank. To some bank, or some other something. The Rothbard notes the example of Missouri Pacific, that after they got a loan, despite an adverse warning by a minority of the Interstate Commerce Commission, as soon as they repaid their debt to J.P. Morgan, they gently were allowed to go into bankruptcy. And apparently, footnote 16, they falsified their balance sheet prior to asking for the RFC loan to claim more cash on hand than they really had. But done. There we go. This is kind of reminiscent of the auto industry in 2000s. Again, basically paying them to pay off their debts, to wealth transfer, to let them go bankrupt, and then take that bankruptcy proceeding and throw it to the people that you want to have the extra funds. John T. Flynn made some good dissents against the RFC. Rothbard notes a couple of these. He pointed out that such loans could only prolong the Depression. Quoting John T. Flynn, Rothbard has in here, quote, prices must come down to bring goods closer to the size of the available income. Income itself must be freed for purchasing by the extinguishment of excessive debts. Any attempt to hold up prices or to save the weaker debtors necessarily prolongs the Depression. He also pointed out that the best way to relieve the railroads was to let them go into receivership. Quote, the quicker the correction comes, the quicker the regeneration of the road will come. Instead of permitting the correction of the fatal flaw, the heavy bond load, the RFC is actually added to the bond load of the railroads. So, yeah. Now, despite the RFC being led by, a socialist and throwing out all of the money that it was given the possibility to lay hands on, Hoover wanted more. He wanted more loans to wider ranged industries faster. And so in the end, they ended up spending $2.3 billion in credits over the course of 1932 and $1.6 billion in cash. Considering that they were only started out with a claim on $1.5 billion, it's pretty amazing that they were able to, spend nearly $4 billion. Most of this went, again, to banks and railroads, and a bunch of it also went into agriculture, especially cotton. Very little of this was actually used for real public works. So it was mostly just a wealth transfer from the taxpayers to the banks. The final chapter, or the final section we're going to cover this week is titled Governmental Relief. And it's talking about how up until now there had not been much direct federal relief, and this right about now was where that Rubicon got crossed. Basically, Hoover said, we really shouldn't do direct federal relief. We really should try to avoid it. We can pay states and have states do federal relief. They'll have better chance of knowing where that relief should go. But he started to give ground grudgingly in 1932 because it was an election year. The New York Temporary Emergency Relief Administration got $25 million. There was the Emergency Relief and Construction Act in July, which gave 3% interest loans to states, more low interest nonsense to inflate the currency some more, up to $300 million. There was a massive increase in state relief efforts as a result. Just to give some numbers, Rothbard notes that in 1929, the total amount of direct relief provided by states to the people were $33 million. In 1932, they had risen to $308 million, nearly a 10 times increase. So, that's going to cover the first half of Chapter 11. In the next week's episode, I'm going to be talking about the sections, the inflation program, which is quite long, so there must have been a lot of inflation. The inflation agitation, which is also quite a few pages and quite long. Mr. Hoover's War on the Stock Market, which at this point I expect it. The Home Loan Bank System, the Bankruptcy Law, and the Fight Against Immigration. It sounds like a lot. Most of the sections are pretty short, but the two inflation ones are quite long, which is why I cut it here, because I wanted to cover the two inflation sections in the same piece. So, with that said, I think we'll call it here for this week. Stay tuned. Come back next week, and we will be hitting up the second half of Chapter 11. And then the week after that will be Chapter 12. And then, I might look at the post matter. There's an appendix that might be worth taking a look at. It's not very long either. We might spend another week on that just for funsies. Although it is kind of numerical, and we've kind of covered it. I think it was part of Chapter 4 or 5, where most of these numbers went in. But we'll see. I'll give it a look, and if I think it's good, we'll go an extra week with it. Anyway, this has been the first half of Chapter 11 of Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression. I appreciate you sticking around with me. I hope you have enjoyed this book. We're almost done. 2 or 3 more weeks. And, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If there's anything you want to do to help out the channel, you know what you can do. And, I will see you all next time. Thanks a bunch.